Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, this is your Inept General, and welcome to my Dark Elf roster reveal. Sorry it's a bit late. If you've been keeping up with the channel, you'll notice from the latest channel update why this is a little bit late, but forgive me for that, guys. Let's just get on with it today then, shall we? Let's start things off by discussing some of the general rules that were spoken about during the Dark Elf reveal. Now, the most important one mentioned was probably the idea of Murderer's Prowess. Now, this doesn't work like Martial Prowess does for the High Elves. For the High Elves, it's when they're kind of pristine and at the peak of their battle efficiency, they fight better before they've taken any damage. For the Dark Elves, it's much more about the amount of kills that are happening on the battlefield that appease the Lord of Murder, Cain himself, at which point he's like, good job hacking each other to death, guys. Feel better, here's a little bonus for you, a gift of Cain, if you will, and bestows them with more strength or more melee attack or whatever they happen to be given. We're not 100% sure what the blessing looks like yet, but that's what we've been told so far. Now, this opens up a lot of interesting effects because the killing isn't just the amount of killing your army's doing, it's just the amount of killing going on the battlefield. So that both encourages you as a Dark Elf player to chase after some more weak units in Total War Warhammer 2, or it encourages you to buy some cheap units, throw them forward, and then just wait for them all to be killed. Then you get your Murderer's Prowess, and you charge forward your whole army when you have that. Now, the effect itself is said to last a little over a minute, so we haven't been told whether you'll get the chance to get Murderer's Prowess multiple times in the battle, but I have to assume you would be, rather than just a one-time use for a minute, and you really have to make that minute count in the battlefield. So I assume it's repeating, but have to wait for that to be confirmed. So that's really what it looks like. I think it will really change the way you fight tactically with the Dark Elves, waiting for this bonus to come into power. So I just think it's an interesting little way of doing it, and I kind of like its implementation. Now, just as a bit of background, guys, before we delve into the units that have been revealed on the roster, I'm not going to delve fully into the lore of each one of these kinds of units, where they come from, what they played like on the tabletop comparatively. That's because I've kind of done all that already in my potential Dark Elf army video, which you can find in the top right-hand corner now, or down in the description below. But that's where you'll get all the lore. I'm just going to kind of touch over in this video the units that have been revealed, what we know about them in Total War Warhammer 2, and just kind of my opinions on them going forward. So without further ado, guys, let's kick things off. So let's start off with the Lords. Now, for the Legendary Lords, we know that the first Lord is Malekith, King of the Dark Elves. If you'd like a bit of his story, what he's about, where he comes from, do click in the top right-hand corner where I cover him and his mother, Morathi, who is also the other Legendary Lord for the Dark Elves, and we go over some of their story there. But do that, either top right-hand corner or description below. But Malekith's in the game, melee magic lord. On the tabletop, he only had the lore of dark magic, if I remember correctly, and I think that's all he'll have in Total War Warhammer 2 as well. But he will get several different options for mounts. He'll have the choice of a cold one, which for the uninitiated is essentially a kind of raptor-like creature. He'll have the choice of a cold one chariot. He'll have the choice of Seraphon, his black dragon. And his black dragon, like all black dragons in the Dark Elf army, will have a flame breath weapon known as Noxious Cloud, I think it was, on the tabletop. But that's him. He'll be a decent melee fighter. He'll be a good magic user. Kind of a bit of an all-round. But looking forward to playing as Malekith. I think he looks great in the model. I think he looks pretty good. So I'm looking forward to seeing him in action in Total War Warhammer 2. Now, his mother, Morathi, I thought looked a bit bad in the trailer. I think she looks better in this image they released. The hands are still a bit creepy. You wouldn't want to have them all over you at any point, I don't suppose. But the hands are a bit creepy. But apart from that, I think she looks better in this image than she did during that trailer. She looked a bit sickly in that trailer. But she's meant to be a very attractive woman. That's kind of one of her key traits. A complete arsehole, for lack of a better word, but a particularly attractive one at that. So there she is. She has the halberd there and the sword. In the trailer, we only saw of the halberd. We'll have to wait and see what she'll actually look like in game. It may be a whole debacle like the Fey Enchantress and the cup. That she had that was an item of hers, but it doesn't appear. It appeared in her promotional imagery, but she never had it in the game, I don't think. So we'll have to wait and see for that, guys. But that's Marathi. She'll be a very powerful magic user. In Total War Warhammer, in Warhammer the tabletop, she had access to the Lore of Death, the Lore of Shadow, and the Lore of Dark Magic. So I'm interested to see if they will give her all three like they have done for the Vampire Count Legendary Lord, or they just give her a combination one, particularly as more skill points go into magic now. But we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. Looking forward to seeing what her upgrade tree looks like. But Marathi, probably the most potent magic user amongst the Dark Elf Legendary Lords. So moving on from the Legendary Lords, let's look at the more generic Lords. And so far, what we've really got as the only two options for generic Lords for the Dark Elves are the Dreadlord and the female Dreadlord. Now, just going back to the male Dreadlord briefly, the male Dreadlords, as we've seen them, are going to be more focused on missile attacks rather than melee attacks, and the females, which we've seen here in this lovely screenshot, are going to be much more focused on the melee attacks. So that's really going to be the distinguisher between the two, but unlike the High Elves with the male and female princes and princesses, you will not see them have different mounts, I don't believe. I think they both have the Dark Steed, the Cold One, the Dark Pegasus, the Black Dragon. I think they have the same mounts going through the upgrade tree, and that will be about it for the Lords, for the Dark Elves. So moving on away from the Lords, now I'm just going to say at this point, there are a number of Dark Elf general types that are missing from this, but we'll go over all the missing units later on in this video. But let's go on to the heroes. Now the first hero that comes up is the Cainite Assassin. I think they look pretty good. Yeah, I think they look alright. I think they do the job. They look suitably assassiny enough, but these guys are more missile focused. Now maybe just in my head, I always had them much more imaged as a melee-focused assassin. They did have the option to have missiles on the tabletop, but that was always just my own personal preference and the way I sort of envisaged them. But that's alright, that's fine if they're a missile hero. They will have Stalk. They have a number of different abilities that were discussed. They'll have a selection of poisons, which I imagine will work as abilities on the upgrade tree that you get along the way. And one of the ones they apparently get from the very start is an Acid Flask, which allows you to go up to gates during sieges and with one of these stealthy Cainite assassins and just open the gates. Now this is potentially a very powerful tool during a siege battle. Now a lot of the other armies kind of have this. It's been just directly told to us that the High Elves have an ability called Hammer of Anvil. The Lizard Men, some of them, like Mazda Mundi, has an ability that kind of shifts the earth and on the tabletop would destroy buildings. Now, I'm not sure if you've had confirmation that destroys buildings during sieges, but it very well may do. But at least we've had a confirmation on the High Elf end of things. So there seems to be abilities that each of these armies are getting that can potentially very quickly cause breaches in the wall. Now, this is interesting. It will make battle sieges more tricky for human players against AI, because they will just allow them to break through the wall in easier ways. Whereas it will also maybe make sieges shorter. I'm not sure the motivation behind them doing this, behind letting each of the armies have a particular way of getting through siege defenses a little bit quicker. It's maybe because players could just too easily, especially once a place was fully fortified, could just too easily see off wave after wave after wave of enemy that came in. And maybe this is a way of sorting out that AI issue by giving the AI some tools to deal with quick breaches in the wall, quickly opening gates against the enemy, stuff like that, just to make sure that when you're, as the human player on single player campaign, just being able to hold off better. Now, human against human, I think it might make sieges maybe too harder to defend, and it might actually have a detrimental effect on that one. But you never really see sieges in multiplayer anyway, so will it matter that much? Who knows? We'll have to wait and see. But it's something that it seems they've taken a design decision to do, which is give armies at least one way in which they can easily bypass siege defenses, or at least make breaches in the wall. So the Cainite Assassin has that ability. It's probably a good sniper, good at doing damage to enemy heroes and stuff like that, and can sneak around the battlefield. I have to imagine they'll have Stalk, so they'll be able to move invisibly unless you get close enough to them. So that is the Cainite Assassin. Next up, we have the Death Hag. Now, the Death Hag is a unit I was surprised to see. For those of you who aren't new to my channel, you'll know I didn't actually expect to see the Death Hag in the starting heroes for the Dark Elves. But here they are. Glad to see they're here. They will be your melee-focused hero. Now, they also have an ability, which is the Witch Brew, which is something they can drink, which essentially sets them on Rampage, which, for those of you who don't know, is something that the Lizard Men have a lot of going on, but effectively gives you some attack buffs, but the player loses control of their unit while they're in Rampage. So you can give your Death Hag Rampage, but you won't be able to control her for a certain amount of time. Although when she is out of control, she's still attacking all the time, but you just can't control who she's attacking or what she's attacking or for how long for. So she'll have that ability. She'll also have a mount known as the Cauldron of Blood. Now, we've seen the Cauldron of Blood in the game on the little screenshot here on the left-hand side of the screenshot behind the Hydra. You'll notice it there in the background. But the Cauldron of Blood is a shrine to Cain, effectively, and it has witch elves on it and the witch hag herself on it, and it gives all kinds of sort of buffs on the battlefield. All they really went into in the reveal was that it will give the witch hag ability to cast Rampage on units, so you can actually deliberately give units Rampage. Will make them fiercer fighters, but again, you as the player will lose control over them temporarily. So that's what the Cauldron of Blood does, and it will charge through. It'll probably have a decent charge on it as well, one would have to imagine, and do some good damage when it's in melee too. But for all the stats on that, we'll have to wait for the pure stat card to come out, and we'll take it from there once it does. But that's the mount for the Death Hag. So moving on from the Death Hag, we have Sorceresses. Now, the only heroes in the game for the Dark Elves who can do magic, short of the legendary lords themselves. So I imagine these will probably be a must to take with you, just to kind of have someone casting some magic. Now, the Sorceresses themselves have access to the mounts of a Death Steed and a Pegasus, a Dark Pegasus, and the Cold One as well. So they have a few mounts. You'd probably want to put them on a Dark Pegasus unless you're going up against a heavy flyer unit army. But there we go. That is the Sorceress. And I think, if I remember correctly, the Sorceresses have access to all 8 laws of magic. Not at one go, only one at a time, bear in mind. And the option to maybe have the Sorceress specialize in dark magic as well. I may do a separate video to go through what dark magic is, much like I've done for the Skaven magic as well. But we'll have to wait and see for that one. Let me know if you want to see that down in the comments below, guys. So there's the Sorceress, and let's move on to the Infantry. Now, the Infantry, the first one we have are the Bleak Swords, kind of your basic sword and shield militia for the Dark Elves. They're particularly arrogant. They really all see themselves as kind of legends of history and like the greatest warriors ever born, but really they're just your low-cost militia. And the next up are the Dread Spears, which again, spear unit with shields. You'll probably get the variant between them. I can't remember if they stated between that. But I think you'll get both. You'll also get the Dark Shards. We saw the Dark Shards in the trailer. And these guys, which I find particularly interesting, is that they will be a cheap missile unit, but they'll be a cheap missile unit with armor piercing. Now, depending on their range, they could be potentially hugely dangerous to armies like the Army of Chaos, like the Dwarven army, maybe even more so, because they have much less mobility. Now, the Elves, because they're Elves, they'll be quick. Now, if they have more range than the Dwarves, then these guys will represent a real problem against any Dwarven army. So it's good to see that little bit of variety there, but I think range is the key. What is the Dark Shards range? What is the range of the repeater crossbows that they have? So we'll have to wait and see for that, but excited to see those guys. Next up, we have the Black Ark Corsairs. Now, these guys are going to act as a kind of hybrid missile and melee fighting force. You'll have the variety with sort of hand bows, hand weapons, and they can have 2 hand weapons, so they really can be a potentially devastating melee attacking force as well. And they also have the Sea Dragon Hide, which affords them extra protection going forward as well. So pretty hardy, can shoot, can fight, pretty handy unit all round. But again, not necessarily comparable to something like the High Elves Lefern Sea Guard, because they will be used more in an offensive capacity. So we'll have to see how they work. Interested to get my hands on them. I did not actually think the Black Ark Corsairs were going to be in the game, but I'm delighted to see they made the cut. And here I think we've actually seen the Black Ark Corsairs in action on this screenshot. The closest guy to us, I think, is a Black Ark Corsair, and he's around his brothers in arms there, all with their two-hand weapon variant, and they are just about to mow down some elven spears. So, moving on from Black Ark Corsairs, we have the Shades. Now, the Shades are the stealthy fighters of the Dark Elves. They will have Stalk, and they will be able to sneak in and shoot off weapons. Don't know if they'll have something like Snipe as well, which, for those of you who don't necessarily know, is the ability in Total War Warhammer to remain hidden while shooting. I don't think they'll have that, because I think their range might be a bit more limited, but they will have a lot of different variants to them. They'll have the ability to have a hand weapon, the ability to have two hand weapons, or the ability to have a great sword, or a great weapon, as it were. So the great weapon will give them armor piercing. So really a lot of flexibility in terms of how you want to recruit these guys, what you want to use them for. And these guys will be great for sneaking up on things like missile, on artillery pieces, on lords maybe who have even been left by themselves. Stuff like, or maybe protect, maybe more magical lords, something like that. And that would be tremendously handy to have them that way. So really looking forward to seeing how these guys work. They will have Infiltrate, as I said, stealthy, getting around the battlefield, have to be clever in the way you use them. I imagine they will be fairly squishy as well, however. And here we have the iconic Dark Elf unit, the Witch Elves. Now, the Witch Elves, I'm delighted to see. We saw them in the announcement trailer for Total War Warhammer 2, and these girls will be a lot to handle. They will probably be able to dole out huge amounts of damage, but I do think they will be weak to missile fire. They won't be hugely heavily armored, I can't imagine, but they have, they will be able to do just a huge amount of damage going in with their two weapons. They apparently have a poison that can cause rampage to the unit they're fighting. Now, I have to imagine the version of rampage they cause as a kind of poison effect has to debuff the enemy, right? Because rampage, if you give it to yourself, makes you a stronger fighter. Now, if the Witch Elves are engaged with this unit, they don't want to make the opposition stronger. That would be lunacy. So one has to imagine it's a debuff rampage mode where the enemy player just loses control of their unit, and the Witch Elves go to town on them, while they're, I have to imagine, debuffed as well, but we'll have to wait to see how that works exactly in Total War Warhammer 2. But they also, the other ability the Witch Elves have is Master Murderous Prowess. Sorry about that, got my tongue tied there. Which effectively gives them maybe an increased buff to the Murderous Prowess gift that you can get as the Dark Elf army, which I mentioned at the top of the video. But that's the Witch Elves for you. Next up, we have the Executioners, guys who really specialize in greatsword fighting. They love the idea of the killing stroke, real precision killers. They don't get all like hyped up like the Witch Elves and like bathe themselves in the blood of their enemies and get all tizzied up. These guys are just cold-hearted murderers. They try to murder with maximum efficiency, least amount of movement. But good to see these guys. I thought maybe these guys might be left out to be part of a DLC pack, but I'm glad to see them included in the base game. Can't wait to see them. Now, some people may stipulate that this unit here in this screenshot is maybe the Executioners because they have the shorter helms as well, but I don't think they are the Executioners. It is a possibility. I think those are more likely to be the Shades with great weapons. That would be my guess, but we will really have to wait and see on that one. I'm not 100% sure. Because the helmets don't seem to match, particularly the concept art that was released before. But you never know. That might be them, but I doubt it. So we'll have to wait and see. Next up, we have the Black Guard, changed from childhood to be Malekith's personal protectors. These guys are an elite halberdier unit. They will have charge defense against large, but not like the Phoenix Guard. Perhaps one could describe as their high elf equivalent, but not really. They don't have charge defense against all. So that's a little bit of debuff, but they're said to be more offensive and will charge other enemy units. Now, I have to imagine to encourage the player to do this, they maybe have a bit more of a charge bonus than your typical halberdier unit, but we'll have to wait to get our hands on some stats to prove out that ability. But that's them, the Black Guard. They'll be pretty good, maybe not as good as the Phoenix Guard, or at least they won't be able to hang on as long as the Phoenix Guard in combat. So let's move on to the Cavalry, shall we? And the first cavalry we have up are the Dark Riders. Now, I think the variants for these guys is Dark Riders with spears, Dark Riders with spears and shields, and then Dark Riders with repeater crossbows as a missile cavalry. So fast cav, I think, might be particularly important for the Dark Elf units. Not because some units can kind of get by without, some armies can kind of get by without fast cav, and it doesn't really make a difference to them. I'd maybe throw in something like Chaos to that, although a bunch of Hounds do tend to come in handy from time to time. But these guys will be particularly important for the Dark Elves, I think, in terms of running down units and getting those kills under your belt so you can trigger Murderer's Prowess. So I think they will be probably included in more armies than most fast cavalry just to do that and to get up that Murderer's Prowess number. So those are the Dark Riders. Handy, their missile variant cannot move while firing, which is something other Elven cavalry missiles have all, I think, been able to do. So that's a bit of detriment to them, but I have to imagine if they are still, they can probably fire out a lot of missiles fairly quickly due to their repeater crossbows. So looking forward to seeing the Dark Riders. We have seen them in a screenshot. They appear here charging through the middle, which I would argue is a way you should perhaps never use your fast cavalry, charging straight into the middle of the battle, but there we go, they do feature there briefly. Now, the other cavalry that the Dark Elves have are the Cold One Knights. Now, as they've done with a number of elite cavalry units from the tabletop, Creative Assembly have split these into two types. There's the Cold One Knights with lances, which are kind of your shock cavalry. They'll have a higher charge value. They'll be used to really go in, do damage on the charge, come out, cycle charge, go back in again. And that's really what they're looking at being. And they'll be anti-large as well, so be your anti-cavalry unit to use too. But because they're riding Cold Ones, which are essentially dinosaurs, which are hard to tame properly, they will suffer from what the rule they're calling as primal instincts, which is they will be susceptible to rampage. So you could lose control of these units if enough damage is done against them. So you get enough missiles into them, you just get enough people fighting them, they will just go into rampage mode and you will lose control of them. Now, the biggest aspect about rampage mode I found, having had the brief chance to play a mission of the game, was that it's not necessarily about losing control of them at that moment, because yes, with a shock cavalry there is a detriment because you can't cycle charge because you've lost control of that unit, but they're still like in rampage, they're still doing some damage, they're still fighting. But the problem comes into losing track of them. So if they fight, they get rampage, they're fighting perhaps even harder, then the unit they're fighting breaks and they chase them, but they're still on rampage and there's nothing you can do to call them back. It's just a matter of keeping an attention to when they come back and being able to make maximum usage of them once they're back. That's really the biggest detriment to rampage, not necessarily in the fight they're in, but in the stage of what happens next during the battle. So the other unit of Cold One Knights are called Cold One Dread Knights, and they'll be much more the melee-focused ones. I think he mentioned they'll be armed with massive maces, which is an interesting change, but that's what the Cold One Knights 2 variants will look like. Shock cavalry, melee cavalry for really getting in there and grinding it out. So moving on from the Cold One Knights, we are going on to the chariot for the Dark Elves, and the only chariot they have, not in the lore, but in the Total War Warhammer game, will be the will be the Cold One chariots. And this, again, because there are cold ones, will be susceptible to panic and rampage. But this is also a missile chariot with, I think they said, 2 repeater crossbowmen on the back. Now, this opens up an interesting possibility, because as I mentioned I mentioned this in one of my previous videos, I think, but one thing that Creative Assembly had noticed was that with the missile chariots in Total War Warhammer 1, they weren't particularly happy with the damage output that the missiles were doing. So their idea was to make missile chariots in Total War Warhammer 2 put out more missiles. So I think it was the High Elf chariot they used an example. Now, whereas it previously might have put out 1 missile, it's putting out 3 missiles every volley, which is interesting. But with the repeater crossbow, the question has to be, does that then become even more than 3 missiles going out of every volley? Because they have such rapid firing until they need to reload. So the question would be then, does that mean there'd be even more than several missiles going out? In which case, that could mean this might be the first truly viable missile chariot we've seen in Total War Warhammer so far, at least as far as fighting against other players in multiplayer might go. But even with that, they will have anti-infantry, and they will be able to do damage on the charge. So even once you're out of missiles, they can still be getting the kills in. Now, I still stick to the philosophy that I'm not a huge fan of using chariots, but chariots do scare me, particularly when they're in an AI army. So these could be a potentially really dangerous unit in the hands of the AI, so watch out for them on the battlefield. So let's move into the monsters of the Dark Elf army, and the first one up is the Harpies. I think essentially we are going to get a reskinned version of the Beastmen Harpies. They'll look maybe a bit darker, a bit more purpley, maybe they'll have breasts, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. But that's it really, the Harpies. And the big boy of the day, the star of the trailer, the War Hydra. Huge monster, massive regenerating ability, fire breath weapon. We've seen that in the trailer. Hopefully that just wasn't for the trailer. And hopefully it's an aimed fire breath weapon rather than just an animation. That's what I'd ideally like to see, much like they've done for dragons. But so far, I don't know if they've confirmed that, except the fact we've seen a fire attack. But we'll have to wait and see whether it operates more like something like, say, the Iron Drake, where it just fires automatically, or it operates like a dragon where you can aim the breath attack. We'll have to wait and see on that one. But the War Hydra on the tabletop has a couple of interesting rules that they didn't say were necessarily going to be carried over, and that's the more damage you do against a Hydra, the less damage it can do back to you. So that'd be an interesting way of using this monstrosity. So the more weakened it is, the less effective it is. So it actually encourages the player to withdraw the Hydra from combat, let it rest, let it heal up quickly, and then send it back in so it can be at its most efficient killing. So that would be an interesting mechanic to see. We're not sure if they've brought it into the game, but there we go. That's the War Hydra. Looking forward to seeing it. It looks great. We've seen it in screenshots. It looks monstrous and enormous and huge. Can't wait to see it. It looks like probably one of the most exciting units, I think, in Total War Warhammer 2 so far. I love the little touch of like the rattlesnake tail at the end. I just can't wait to see this guy in action. Maybe one of my favorite units revealed so far. I think it just looks amazing. Okay, so that is the Hydra, guys. And next up, we have the Black Dragon. So it's kind of like the idea of a feral Black Dragon. It'll just be by itself. It won't necessarily have a rider on it. It will have the breath attack weapon. It can go up. It can be a decent weapon to have in your arsenal as a Dark Elf player. So there we go, Black Dragon as well. And that really covers all the monsters. Last but not least, the artillery, the Reaper Bolt Thrower. I think this will probably have 2 firing modes, much like the High Elf one. So there we go, that is the Reaper Bolt Thrower. Now let's go over what some of you may be more interested in me covering, which is the units we do not have in the game. So let's start off with some of the missing generals. Now, probably the most significant missing general is the Supreme Sorceress. The Dark Elves do not have a magic user general, which is pretty surprising, actually. I thought that most armies would always have a magic user general, but they don't, apart from the legendary lords, of course. So that adds a very different element into how maybe Dark Elves play, or how they at least assign their slots, because I think almost everyone now will have to take a magic hero, because they can't take a magic general. But there we go. No sorceresses, so there we go. Poor sorceresses. So moving on from that, we don't have a high Beastmaster, which effectively would give bonuses to things like your monsters in the tabletop version of the game, but this was not an option. It may be something that comes along later on in Total War Warhammer 2, perhaps as a free LC or a DLC general. And the third type of general we don't have for the Dark Elves is the Black Ark Fleet Master. Now that's a lot of missing types of general. Now the Black Ark Fleet Master could have all kinds of things like bonuses to Corsairs and campaign movement bonuses over the ocean, attrition lessened over the ocean, all kinds of fun you could have with a Black Ark Fleet Master, but you never know, they may appear in a later version of the game. And one of the heroes which didn't appear, which was I thought was definitely a shoo-in, was the Master. This is essentially a downgraded version of the Dreadlord. Now this guy I thought would be like your melee focus master, like the Empire Captain in Total War Warhammer 1. And I thought they'd play very similarly, but no, hasn't made it in the game, may make an appearance later on, but not in it so far. So those are kind of the heroes and the lords. Let's move on to the units. So the first one that's not making an appearance are the Sisters of Slaughter. Now these guys would be able to kind of jump over as part of their charge, like lines of units, so they could really like disturb things and have this enormous jump ability. I have no idea how that would be implemented in Creative Assembly's Total War Warhammer, but I was looking forward to it. But alas, we may have to wait on that one. These girls are all gladiators. They're from a guild of gladiators. As I've said, guys, if you want a bit more lore on any of these units, do check my potential Dark Elf army list video down in the description below. But these are the Sisters of Slaughter, didn't make the cut. The Doomfire Warlocks. Now, the most similar unit to the Doomfire Warlocks and what we've seen from Creative Assembly so far are the Wood Elf units, the Sisters of Thorn. And I only say they're similar in that they both have magical spells sort of bound to them. So spells that they can cast without necessarily using the Winds of Magic. Now, these guys would have Doombolt and Soul Blight as their magical spells, and that would be hugely handy in a fast cav unit. You could very much see you picking these guys over something like maybe a Dark Rider with Spears unit because they have those magical abilities. And I think they cause fear as well. I'm not 100% sure, I can't remember that exactly off the top of my head, but they look terrifying. Look at them. So these guys did not make the cut. Doomfire Warlocks. Hopefully we will see them later. And there's a whole bunch of interesting lore about why they look the way they do and how they are male magic casters in the Dark Elf Society, which is relatively rare. So that's all interesting. But as I said, do check out my other video for the full lore on these guys. Next, we have the Scourge Runner Chariot. Now, this is kind of tied to the Beastmaster theme. These guys are beast hunters. They fire their bolt thrower into beasts, but it's more of a harpoon. And the idea is that they can, on the tabletop, drag things like a giant or a big monster towards them, out of position, where the enemy player doesn't want them to be. Now, that would be a hugely useful skill to have in Total War Warhammer. But, unfortunately, that would cause a lot of animation headaches, and I can understand why they maybe haven't included it yet. Because can you imagine the animations it would take and the kind of different, say, encoding you'd have to do to harpoon a giant, have it be lurched off its feet, and then dragged across the battlefield, probably colliding with a whole bunch of units around it until it got dragged to the place you needed it to be, or for a certain amount of time. Now, another alternative is that a shot from one of these guys could maybe just bring down a giant, and it would have to just lie down for a certain amount of time, not doing any damage, kind of paralyze it to a certain extent. That's kind of the lazy way out. But I really look forward to hopefully seeing the implementation of the Scourge Runners in the future. But again, with all the complexities around the animation of the idea of what the Scourge Runners do, I can maybe understand if we never see them. But we'll have to wait and see for that one. Hopefully we do see them, and it will be pretty cool to see them at that. Next up, we have the Medusas. Medusas, monsters, they would be a monstrous infantry. They would get in there, do a lot of damage. They're a great little unit to have, but they unfortunately haven't made an appearance, and neither has a mount for a Medusa, but Medusas aren't really a hero. It's a bit weird, but neither has the Bloodrat Shrine, which has a Medusa on it. Again, Games Workshop has just kind of used the same model as the Blood Shrine, but they've changed a couple of things. So Creative Assembly could use the same trick. I think we probably will see Medusas later on, but I'll get into my DLC theories later on now that we've seen the full roster. So after Bloodrat Shrine, so far I don't think there's anything I've been hugely upset about not necessarily making the cut yet, until we get to this, the Charybdis. This is probably the Charlemagne problem. This would probably cost 6 or 7 Charlemagnes to animate, as apparently now Charlemagnes are the currency by which we dictate how much DLCs cost in any Total War games going forward. But if the Beastman Jabberslav was a few Charlemagnes, this would probably be a bit few more. It would be a hulking monstrosity. It would probably, or should probably, be bigger than the Hydra in the game. It really is, I think, yeah, a melee fighting machine, absolutely deadly. It has things like the Abyssal Howl as special abilities, and it has to be summoned from the depths of the ocean itself by sorcerers. It's the only way they can really come close to taming one of these absolutely devastating creatures. So this is a creature I'd have loved to have seen in Total War Warhammer 2, but unfortunately, it looks like we will not have the Charybdis in the foreseeable future. I think maybe once the Jabberslav comes out, we might get a Charybdis, but it's going to be a long wait, guys. So I don't see it coming in a DLC. I would love love to be proven wrong, but just don't see it happening, unfortunately, if it wasn't in the starting lineup. So let's move on from those bitter disappointments to some optimism for the future. What are we likely to see coming up? Now, for my money, I think the next Legendary Lord we're going to see, or next Legendary Lord DLC pack for the Dark Elves, will be Helbrun. Now, Helbrun is essentially the priest or the pope of the Dark Elf religion of the worship of Cain. Now, she really leads the Church of Cain, more than Marathi even, and she really has relationship with units like the Executioners, like the Witch Elves, and the Cainite Assassins, all units that are really heavily tied to the cult of Cain. But they're already in the army, so she'd probably have bonuses to them, one would hope. I hope they don't do an Isabella von Carstein and kind of tie her to beasts and then release like the Beastmaster with her and then the Scourge Runner Chariot. I hope they don't do that. So I think what they're more likely to do is Helbrun we're probably going to see in a DLC pack with a High Elf army, and the High Elf Legendary Lord will probably be the Everqueen. So it'll be the two lassies going up against each other, and they'll be fighting it out. So, what are we likely to see then from the DLC packs? The High Elves have a lot of female units that would be tied very closely with the Everqueen. So assuming they're going on that theme of like lady killers and female warriors and stuff like that, then probably what we're going to see is Helbrun with the Sisters of Slaughter, with perhaps as a new general type, the Supreme Sorceresses, and perhaps with the Medusas as well. So that's what I'm seeing. Sorry, I had a bit of a mind blank there for a moment. So yeah, Medusas, Sisters of Slaughter, maybe they'd throw in the Supreme Sorceress as well as the hero with that pack, and we'll have to wait and see. But that thematically is a pack that kind of ties together, and Crit Assembly like to kind of roughly tie their packs up thematically with things. So that's kind of how I see the next batch of units, or at least DLC units, we are going to get for the Dark Elves will probably be Helbrun, the Supreme Sorceress, the Sisters of Slaughter, and the Medusas, and their chariot as well, the Medusas have. So that's my theory. Let me know if you guys agree. I also think we might get a Lockyer Fellheart kind of pirate and invader DLC, but for all my DLC theories, they've been a bit changed by all the roster reveals, but it's still fairly interesting, guys. Check the top right hand corner now for all my future theories on DLC packs for Total War Warhammer 2, or find it in the description below. But other than that, guys, that kind of brings us to a close. On the whole, I'm pretty happy with it. There are a few missing units. I think ones I'm most disappointed about, as I've said, the Charybdis. I'd have loved to have seen the Sisters of Slaughter, them jumping high into the air for their charge, landing right in the middle of enemy units, rather than from one side, and just sort of slaughtering them from the middle out. I think would have been a great little animation to see. But unfortunately, they didn't make the cut. But I'm sure they will appear at some point. The Charybdis, I'm less hopeful about. But you know what, fingers crossed. Maybe at the end of all of this, maybe at the end of the third game, we'll just get a pack that they call 27 Charlemagnes, and we'll get the Jabberlife, and we'll get the Charybdis, and we'll get some of the other monsters I'm sure we might miss along the way with some other future armies. But that's about it, guys. I'd like to give a huge thank you to you all for watching. Special thanks to my patrons, Reese, Colin, Thomas, Mateus, Samuel, Matthews, David, Sign of the Emperor, and Niblets. Thank you guys for supporting me on Patreon, and I hope to catch all of you on the next one, guys. Alright, see you later.